It is the year 1167, and England lies in uneasy silence. The fog rolling in from the Thames carries the sound of hammers, bells, and soft chanting from monasteries that dot the damp countryside. Amid this misty quiet, a boy is born into power he was never meant to have. His name is John, the youngest son of King Henry Tullier and Eleanor of Aquitaine. No one, not even his mother, expects greatness from him. He is a spare heir, a footnote in the grand plans of empire. While his older brothers, Henry the young king, Richard the Lionheart, and Geoffrey of Brittany, carve their names into the world through war, John grows up in the corners of courtly life. He learns not valor but patience, not courage but cunning. Even in childhood, people whisper about John's smallness, not just of stature, but of spirit. Chroniclers describe him as intelligent yet slippery, with eyes ever searching for opportunity. His tutors note his talent for administration, law, and the tedious art of royal paperwork. Where others train for battle, John learns the slow rhythms of governance, ledgers, tithes, taxes, the endless exchange of parchment and seals that made up medieval rule. It is perhaps the most boring education a prince could receive, and yet it will define his reign. England at the time of John's birth is a restless land, bound not just to its island, but to a sprawling web of territories across France. Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, the so-called Angevin Empire, stretches from Scotland to the Pyrenees. But it is an empire of personalities more than permanence. His father, Henry Tullier, rules through sheer will, his grip held together by endless travel and a famously bad temper. When Henry is not quarreling with his wife Eleanor, he is fighting with his sons. The family is a nest of ambition and resentment. In 1173, when John is only 6, his brothers rise in open rebellion against their father, a rebellion partly encouraged by their mother. John, too young to fight, watches as loyalty becomes a shifting thing. His brothers betray their father, his father imprisons his mother, the kingdom survives only by exhaustion. In the midst of this turmoil, Henry jokingly calls John Lackland. It is not meant kindly. All the elder sons have been promised lands and titles, but John, the youngest, has nothing left to inherit. The nickname sticks, becoming a prophecy. John's early life unfolds in a series of quiet, bureaucratic moments that rarely make it into grand histories. He attends councils, learns the dry mechanics of feudal law, and accompanies clerks who calculate scutage, the payments knights owe to avoid military service. These small lessons form the foundation of his later rule. When Henry finally dies in 1189, it is Richard the Lionheart who inherits the throne. John, once again, is left behind, though not forgotten. Richard sees his brother as a potential nuisance but also a tool. When Richard leaves for the Third Crusade, he entrusts the kingdom's administration to others, assuming John will remain loyal. He does not. In Richard's absence, John moves quickly. The kingdom, long used to its king being abroad, becomes fertile ground for ambition. John forges alliances with powerful barons, manipulates court politics, and quietly gathers wealth. He begins calling himself king, in letters, a small act of arrogance that foreshadows his future. But his plans collapse when Richard returns unexpectedly in 1194, released from his German captivity. John's plots are revealed. Chroniclers describe the king's fury as terrible. His younger brother flees, stripped of lands and dignity. For the moment, John's career appears finished, and yet fate has strange patience. Richard dies suddenly in 1199, struck by a crossbow bolt during a minor siege in France, a wound that festers and turns fatal. The great Lionheart, conqueror of Acre and terror of kings, dies not in battle but from infection, a quiet, mundane death. With no heirs, the crown passes at last to the unloved brother. John Lackland becomes King John of England. His coronation at Westminster Abbey is attended by few who truly wish him well. The chronicler Roger of Wendover writes that John's face seemed both fearful and calculating, as though he doubted the crown even as it was placed upon his head. He inherits an empire already fraying. The French king, Philip IV Augustus, is eager to reclaim Normandy. The English barons are weary from years of war taxes. The church, still licking its wounds from Henry's quarrels with Thomas Becket, watches John with quiet suspicion. Yet for a time, John rules competently. He is a man of paperwork, not glory, and in the calm years between 1199 and 1202, his court hums with administrative energy. He reforms the coinage, standardizes weights and measures, and oversees the creation of thousands of legal documents that survive to this day. His bureaucrats record every penny owed to the crown, from castle tolls to pig taxes. He is in essence the first modern English monarch in terms of governance. But his methods are cold. John sees loyalty as a transaction. He buys support, then demands repayment. His legal reforms, though efficient, become tools for punishment. Debts are manipulated to destroy rivals. Marriages are arranged, annulled, or confiscated according to convenience. He fines nobles for everything, even for refusing royal marriage proposals. What began as reform slowly hardens into tyranny. By 1202, war returns. Philip Terry invades Normandy, testing the strength of John's empire. John's leadership in battle proves weak. He mistrusts his generals, delays decisions, and withdraws troops at critical moments. When his nephew Arthur of Brittany, a legitimate rival for the throne, falls into John's hands, the story takes its darkest turn. Arthur vanishes. Rumors spread that John murdered him in a drunken rage, his body thrown into the River Seine. Whether true or not, the damage is done. His reputation collapses overnight. Chroniclers begin calling him John the Cruel. His allies in France desert him, and within a few years, he loses nearly all his continental territories. Normandy, Anjou, and Maine fall to Philip Sivu. The great Angevin Empire, built by his father, dissolves in less than a decade. John becomes, once again, Lackland. But it is in loss that John's peculiar kind of rule thrives. Returning to England, he tightens control over what remains. His government becomes an engine of taxation and fear. He introduces new customs duties, scutage fees, and arbitrary fines on nobles. Every document must pass through his chancery. Every favour has a price. He sends sheriffs into the countryside to seize lands from disobedient barons. Monks who speak against him find their abbeys stripped of grain. The kingdom grows silent again, not from peace, but from exhaustion. In one particularly dreary winter of 1208, John's dispute with the church deepens into open conflict. The Pope appoints Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury, but John refuses to accept him. In response, the Pope places England under an interdict, meaning no church bells, no burials, no marriages, no sacraments. For 6 long years, the land lives in spiritual limbo. The only sound from churches is the drip of rain on stone. John, unrepentant, confiscates church property and taxes clergy. He grows richer and more despised. By 1212, the baron's patience begins to crumble. Yet John still believes himself untouchable. He is methodical, tireless, and strangely proud of his administrative precision. He once boasted that his account books were as complete as the stars in the sky, but numbers cannot protect a king from hatred. And so, as the year 1214 approaches, John's power stands on a knife's edge. His treasury overflows, but his people seethe. His officials work by candlelight, sealing letters of demand and confiscation late into the night. The realm grows restless beneath the weight of its own bureaucracy. Outside the palace, the roads of England are lined with potholes and mud, the air heavy with the smell of damp parchment and horse sweat. The king's messengers travel ceaselessly, delivering orders that no one dares refuse. Every coin, every acre, every marriage becomes a matter of royal control. And yet, even with all his precision, John cannot see what is coming. You awaken, as if in a dim medieval morning, damp air, the smell of wax and parchment, and the soft tolling of distant bells. It is the year 1214, and England's patience has worn thin. King John, after years of taxation and suspicion, prepares for one last grand campaign to reclaim what he has lost, his ancestral lands in France. It is a war born not of glory but of bureaucratic necessity. The king needs revenue. The treasury groans under the weight of debts owed to mercenaries and allies. He squeezes his barons for one final round of taxes, heavy, relentless, almost vindictive. The old Anglo-Norman nobility, wary of this endless stream of levies and demands, feels its dignity slipping away. The king's letters arrive with mechanical precision, written by clerks whose quills scratch like insects in candlelight. You owe the crown such and such, they write, for lands, for horses, for scutage, for the privilege of breathing royal air. John's government has become a machine of collection, its heartbeat the constant exchange of silver pennies. In May 1214, John sails for France once more. His fleet crosses the Channel in grey weather, banners snapping in the sea wind. But unlike the Crusaders of old, his army is a patchwork of hired troops, mercenaries from Flanders, Poitou, and Gascony, men who fight for coin, not for king. John's plan is ambitious, to strike at King Philip of France from 2 sides, joining forces with German and Flemish allies. It is the last desperate act of a man trying to reclaim his father's empire through ledger and strategy. But the campaign unravels with quiet inevitability. At the Battle of Bouvines in July 1214, John's allies are crushed. His northern coalition collapses, and he is forced to retreat, humiliated, broke, and despised. The news reaches England like a cold wind. The king who taxed his people for war has returned without victory. The men who paid for that war begin to murmur. Their whispers move through castles, across river valleys, through long feasts that end in angry toasts. Enough, they say. We will be robbed no longer. John's response is predictable: more taxes, more fines, more control. His rule becomes suffocating in its detail. He orders inquisitions into the debts of noble families. Sheriffs seize hostages from disobedient barons. Even his personal relationships begin to collapse. His marriage to Isabella of Angoulême, once a political triumph, becomes a distant formality. Chroniclers note that John takes an unusual interest in the wives and daughters of his barons, an unforgivable insult in a society built on fragile honour. By 1215, rebellion simmers openly. The nobility of northern England, the most heavily taxed and least favoured, begin to meet in secret. Among them is Robert Fitzwalter, a baron of immense pride who will soon call himself Marshal of the Army of God and Holy Church. It sounds grand, but their cause is simple: survival. Meanwhile, John's paranoia deepens. He changes his bedding nightly for fear of assassination. He forbids candles near his chamber doors. His sleep grows short and uneasy. Every morning, clerks present him with rolls of parchment, complaints, petitions, demands, and every morning he signs new orders of punishment. The kingdom breathes shallowly under this weight of fear. In the spring of 1215, the barons make their move. Gathering in the north, they ride south under banners that bear the old Norman symbols of wolf and cross. Their numbers swell until they reach the outskirts of London. John, taken by surprise, retreats to the safety of Windsor Castle, then Oxford, and finally Runnymede, a damp meadow beside the River Thames. It is there in June 1215 that history pauses. The meadow smells of mud, grass and river water. The king's pavilion stands opposite the barons' tents, separated by a strip of wet ground. The barons arrive armed but solemn. John arrives surrounded by clerks, secretaries, and rolls of parchment, his true weapons. Between them lies a document, a list of demands that will become known as the Magna Carta. It is easy, centuries later, to imagine the Magna Carta as a moment of triumph for liberty, but at Runnymede it is a negotiation born of fatigue. Neither side truly trusts the other. The document itself is not revolutionary. It is a collection of complaints, promises, and technical reforms, an attempt to place limits on royal abuse and formalize existing rights. Clause after clause concerns small, practical things: no scutage or aid shall be imposed without consent. No free man shall be imprisoned without judgment by his peers. Standard weights and measures shall be maintained. The king's officials shall not seize horses, carts, or wood without payment. To modern ears, these sound like the seeds of democracy. To the men at Runnymede, they are simply a plea for stability, for rules that might stop the slow erosion of their lives under royal greed. John listens with the stillness of a man biding time. His smile, chroniclers note, never reaches his eyes. He signs the charter not out of conviction, but calculation. In the days that follow, scribes make multiple copies, in Latin, written on thick sheets of sheepskin. Messengers carry them to cathedrals and castles across the land. For a brief, fragile moment, it seems peace might return. But King John is not a man who accepts limits easily. By autumn, his letters to Rome reveal his true intentions. He appeals to Pope Innocent III, claiming that he signed the charter under duress. The Pope, still John's ally after years of political bargaining, agrees. In August 1215, the Pope declares the Magna Carta null and void of all validity forever. The ink has barely dried before John's soldiers march again. Civil war erupts. Chroniclers call it the First Barons' War, though in truth it is less a war than a slow unravelling of England's feudal order. John's armies move through the countryside, burning rebel estates, seizing hostages, and besieging castles. Monks record the smoke of burning villages rising above the horizon for weeks at a time. In the north, rebels seek foreign aid. They send envoys to Prince Louis of France, son of Philip, to him, inviting him to claim the English crown. Louis accepts eagerly, landing in England with an army in 1216. For the first time since the Norman conquest, a French prince marches openly on English soil, not as invader but as liberator. John flees from one stronghold to another. Increasingly isolated, his allies dwindle, his finances drain, and his health begins to falter. By October 1216, he is in the fenlands of eastern England, a place of mists, reeds, and winding rivers. The war has broken him. His once meticulous records now fall behind. His clerks struggle to keep pace with the chaos. Still, he moves restlessly, as if the act of travel itself could preserve his authority. He stops at Lynn, modern King's Lynn, where he eats heavily, too heavily perhaps. The chroniclers disagree on the meal. Some say peaches, others raw fruit and ale. Whatever it was, it makes him violently ill. Desperate to reach safety, John rides out toward Newark Castle, crossing the flooded estuaries of the Wash. It is a desolate landscape, flat, endless, and treacherous with hidden tides. Somewhere along the crossing, disaster strikes. The king's baggage train, his wagons filled with gold, documents, and the royal treasure becomes trapped in the mud. The tide rises swiftly. Horses panic, men drown, and the entire royal treasury is swallowed by the sea. For a man obsessed with control, it is the ultimate humiliation. John arrives at Newark feverish, shaking, and broken. Within days, his strength fails. Monks are summoned. Candles are lit. The air inside Newark Castle grows thick with incense and the faint smell of damp straw. The king, once master of an empire, mutters deliriously about his lost treasure and his lost realm. He confesses, receives the last rites, and, on the night of October 18, 1216, dies quietly in his chamber. His body, small and unassuming, is carried to Worcester Cathedral. He is buried before the high altar, dressed in royal robes, his crown placed upon his head. A crown of tin and gilt. Outside, England breathes again. The war does not end immediately, but the fury that sustained it ebbs. The barons, realizing that peace is preferable to further chaos, turn their loyalty to John's young son, Henriothan, a boy of 9. In his name, the Magna Carta is reissued. This time, without deception, it becomes a living document, revised and reaffirmed in the years to come, not a revolution, but a slow redefinition of kingship itself. John's reign, for all its cruelty and pettiness, becomes a boundary line in English history. After him, no monarch rules unchecked. Even the most tedious clauses of the Magna Carta will echo for centuries, shaping laws far beyond England's shores. And yet, one cannot help but imagine John himself, the man behind the documents, sitting alone by candlelight, counting coins and debts until the end. He was a king of paper and ink, not of swords or glory. His downfall came not from madness but from an excess of reason, the cold arithmetic of control. When the tide swept away his treasure, it also carried off the illusion that a kingdom could be ruled entirely by calculation. You awaken again to a sound that seems to come from beneath the earth, a slow, watery rhythm. The tide turning in a flat grey estuary, the Wash. It is October of 1216. The King of England is dying. The air smells faintly of mud and sea salt. Outside the walls of Newark Castle, the world is hushed. Inside, candles burn low beside the king's bed. The once terrible John, who bullied barons and humiliated priests, lies wrapped in linen, his breath shallow, his face swollen from fever. A handful of attendants whisper prayers. The flicker of the candlelight makes his crown, the small, hastily made circlet that replaced the treasure lost in the flood, gleam dully. This is how kingdoms end, not with the roar of armies, but with the soft sound of someone coughing into the dark. In his final days, John is haunted not by the grand failures of his reign, but by the small details. The lost ledgers, the drowned servants, the seals and charters swallowed by the tide. Chroniclers say he kept muttering about the treasure, the gold, the wagons in the mud. Lo to him, those wagons were more than wealth. They were order itself, the fragile network of control that had bound his kingdom together through parchment and tax rolls. To lose them was to lose meaning. His last letters, dictated between bouts of fever, are filled with the language of an account and inventories, debts, lists of castles still loyal, and clerks still in service. Even in death, he tries to balance his accounts, but the realm no longer listens. News of the king's decline travels slowly along the muddy roads of England. Messengers ride through rain-soaked villages, past fields lying fallow, past churches where bells have been silent for years because of the interdict. When they arrive at baronial halls, the news is received with an awkward stillness. Few mourn him. One chronicler from St. Albans wrote simply, "Fell as it is, hell itself is made foller by the presence of John." It is a harsh line, but it captures the mood of the age. Yet even in death, John's story does not end with hatred. What follows is something quieter, stranger, and perhaps more enduring. When he finally dies on the night of October 18, 1216, the country does not erupt in celebration or grief. It exhales, a long, weary sigh of relief. His body is embalmed, wrapped in waxed linen, and laid in a coffin for the journey to Worcester Cathedral. The procession moves slowly, guarded by a few loyal knights and monks. They travel through flooded roads, through towns where people turn away in silence. In some villages, peasants watch the cortege pass from a distance, uncertain whether to bow or spit. To most of them, the king's death changes nothing. The fields must still be tilled, the tithe is still paid, the church still obeyed. It is a reminder that even kings, especially terrible ones, are smaller than the systems they inhabit. When they reach Worcester, the monks receive the coffin in solemn quiet. The cathedral, built in stone and shadow, becomes his final refuge. Beneath the high altar, they open the coffin one last time for viewing. He looks nothing like the portraits that would later emerge. There is no grandeur, no regal composure. His face is gaunt, his lips drawn tight, his eyes half open as if still trying to read the invisible columns of some celestial ledger. They bury him there, surrounded by candles, the sound of Gregorian chant filling the air. A small inscription marks the spot. Here lies John, by the grace of God, King of England. No mention of his deeds, no mention of loss, only his name preserved like a seal on a forgotten document. The political aftermath unfolds quickly. John's 9-year-old son Henry Eyre is crowned within weeks. The coronation takes place not in Westminster, but in the makeshift setting of Gloucester Abbey. The crown used is not gold, but a simple circlet taken from the coffin of his mother, a symbol of how little remained of royal splendour. England is wary of war. The barons, seeing a child on the throne, decide that reconciliation is safer than further rebellion. Prince Louis of France, who had declared himself King of England, suddenly finds his cause slipping away. Within a year, his forces are defeated at Lincoln and Sandwich. He returns to France in silence. Peace, slow and uncertain, begins to return. And then, as if the entire realm were tidying the legacy of a bad dream, the Magna Carta is reissued. Not once, but several times, each version slightly altered, its language refined, its clauses trimmed. What began as a list of baronial complaints becomes something more profound, a written expectation that the crown must obey its own laws. John, the most hated king in English history, becomes, by sheer irony, the father of legal constraint. It is not the kind of legacy he wanted, but it is the kind that lasts. As years pass, memory softens. Chroniclers continue to vilify him, yet bureaucrats quietly honor his work. The royal chancery he built, the accounting systems he perfected, the meticulous record-keeping he demanded, all these survive. The pipe rolls of his reign, vast parchment scrolls listing every penny collected and spent, remain among the most complete administrative records in medieval Europe. They are dull, monotonous, and deeply human. Through them, historians can trace not only the shape of a kingdom, but the pulse of ordinary life, the cost of horse feed, the rent of a mill, the repair of a bridge. Every tedious detail, once part of his tyranny, becomes a key to understanding a vanished world. In this sense, King John's reign did not end with his death. It simply transformed. His failures forced the English state to evolve. His obsession with control made people invent safeguards against control. Even the church, once his bitter enemy, grew stronger after him. The years of interdict had taught English clergy to navigate royal power with more subtlety, and the barons, those pragmatic rebels of Runnymede, became something new, guardians of precedent. They had not fought for democracy or for freedom as we know it. They had fought for their property, their rights, their stability. But in doing so, they opened a door through which later generations would walk. Parliament, common law, constitutional monarchy, all of it, in a strange way, began with John's failure. Imagine now, standing in the quiet nave of Worcester Cathedral. The air is cool and still. Sunlight filters through stained glass, falling across the black marble of John's tomb. The effigy carved there is not fierce, not noble, but wary. The king's hands are folded, his eyes closed in stone sleep. Around him, tourists murmur softly. A guide explains his life in a few careful sentences. But if you listen beyond the guide's voice, if you listen to the silence itself, you can almost hear the rustle of parchment, the faint, steady scratching of quills in candlelight. The heartbeat of administration that never stopped. The Kingdom of England, after all, learned from its terrible king the one lesson he never understood, that order cannot exist without fairness. Centuries later, his story continues to ripple quietly through time. When English settlers carried the Magna Carta to their colonies, they brought with them the ghost of John. The reminder that no ruler stands above written law. The phrase, "No free man shall be imprisoned except by lawful judgment of his peers," echoes in charters, constitutions, and declarations around the world. Each time a government is asked to justify its power, the shadow of a petty medieval king flickers in the background. The king who lost everything so others could not. History often celebrates heroes, but it is the failures, the boring, bureaucratic and broken rulers, who truly shape institutions. John's reign was a study in monotony turned menace, taxes, documents, inspections, and clerks. Yet those very instruments of oppression became the foundation of accountability. He tried to measure everything, and in the end, he was measured himself, weighed by his own ledgers, his own signatures, his own acts. In the damp quiet of medieval England, As the new king's court began to stir again, a few clerks remained at their desks, finishing the work John had left undone. They dried the ink, rolled the parchments, and stamped them with the royal seal, Henricus Rex. Outside, the river continued its endless rhythm, washing against the mudflats where John's treasure had vanished. Somewhere beneath that shifting landscape, iron chests and broken wheels rested in silence, the remnants of a dream of total control. The year is 1380, and the air above Paris hums with the smell of incense and hot wax. Inside the soaring walls of Reims Cathedral, a boy of only 11 stands beneath a canopy of gold. His name is Charles, the sixth of that name, son of Charles V the Wise, and heir to one of the most powerful thrones in Europe. He is small for his age, with delicate features and a gaze that seems always half dreaming. His robes are heavy, stitched with fleur de lis and lined with fur that brushes against his shoes. When the archbishop anoints him with holy oil, the crown of France is lowered onto his head, enormous, glittering, almost absurd on the body of a child. Outside, bells toll and banners flutter. The crowd cheers for their new monarch, Charles le Bien-Aimé, Charles the Beloved. Few could imagine that this gentle boy, crowned in gold, would one day wander the halls of his palace, convinced he was made of glass. Charles's childhood unfolds amid comfort and careful planning. His father, Charles V, had been a wise and pragmatic ruler, perhaps the most competent of the Valois line. He rebuilt France after the disasters of the early 100 Years' War, restored the treasury, and brought order to a kingdom battered by plague and rebellion. Under his rule, the Louvre transformed from fortress to palace, the royal library swelled with manuscripts, and the court became a haven for scholars and architects. The boy Charles grows up in this world of intellect and beauty, surrounded by books, music, and tutors who teach him Latin and philosophy. But when the old king dies, the careful balance of France unravels overnight. At 11, Charles is too young to rule. His uncles, the Dukes of Burgundy, Berry, and Anjou, step forward as regents. Each man has his own ambitions, his own network of allies, and his own vision for the kingdom. They are not wise men like their brother, the late king. They are opportunists. The regency quickly becomes a battleground of vanity and greed. The royal treasury, so carefully rebuilt by Charles V, begins to empty again under the weight of lavish feasts, wars, and new taxes. Meanwhile, the people of France grow restless. The 100 Years' War still smoulders across the Channel. English garrisons occupy Calais and parts of Normandy. Bandits roam the countryside, calling themselves free companies. But within the walls of the royal court, the young king sees none of this. He is adored by those around him, polite, gentle, eager to please. Chroniclers describe him as beautiful and well-shaped, a boy who smiled easily and wept often. Even his uncles, though they fight bitterly among themselves, treat him as a symbol of innocence. By his teens, Charles begins to rule in name. His advisors call him Le Petit Roi, the little king. But there is already something uncanny about him. He spends long hours staring from palace windows, watching clouds drift across the Seine. He speaks softly, almost musically, and seems to move in a world slightly apart from others. In 1385, at age 17, he marries Isabeau of Bavaria, a young woman of striking beauty and quiet intelligence. Their wedding is a grand affair, the streets of Paris hung with garlands, fountains flowing with wine, and minstrels performing in the squares. To the people, it is a moment of hope, a vision of youth and stability after decades of war. But the seeds of tragedy are already in the soil. In his early years as king, Charles tries to emulate his father's wisdom. He reappoints many of his father's ministers, listens to their counsel, and shows a remarkable sense of justice. He abolishes certain taxes, pardons political prisoners, and rides through the streets of Paris unguarded, greeting ordinary citizens. The people adore him. Chroniclers write that never was a king more loved by his subjects. He is called Charles the Well-Beloved, a title he accepts shyly, almost embarrassed by it. But love in politics is fragile. The royal uncles, especially Philip the Bold of Burgundy, resent the growing influence of the young king's counselors. They begin whispering that the boy is being misled, that he is too gentle, too trusting. The court divides. The old guard of Charles V's wise administrators clash with the greedy hands of his brothers. The treasury once again becomes a prize to be fought over. The people, sensing corruption, begin to murmur. In 1388, now 18 and impatient with his uncles, Charles declares his majority and assumes full royal authority. It is a moment of quiet triumph. He dismisses the regency and recalls his father's loyal ministers, men known as the Marmosets, a nickname meaning little monkeys, given to them by their enemies. Under their careful guidance, the kingdom briefly steadies. Roads are repaired, taxes are lightened, and even the army begins to recover its discipline. For 2 precious years, France seems to breathe again. But peace in those times is like a candle, beautiful but easily snuffed out by a single gust. The gust comes in 1392. It begins, as madness often does, with stress. Charles's friend and chamberlain, Olivier de Clisson, is attacked and nearly killed by a nobleman named Pierre de Crown, a violent man protected by the Duke of Brittany. Outraged, the king vows to punish the offender and personally leads an army into Brittany. It is summer. The roads are hot and dusty. The king, dressed in black armor, rides at the head of his troops. He is only 24, strong, handsome, and proud. But something strange happens on the journey. One afternoon, as the army marches through a forest near Le Mans, a ragged man suddenly appears by the roadside. His clothes are torn, his eyes wild. He runs toward the royal procession shouting, "Turn back. Noble king, you are betrayed! Do not advance!" The guards seize him and drag him away, but his words hang in the air like a curse. Moments later, as the army resumes its march, a page carrying the king's lance drops it accidentally. The iron tip strikes a helmet, the sharp clang echoing through the heat. Charles jolts upright in the saddle, his eyes glaze. Then, with a sudden cry, he draws his sword and turns on his own men. Before anyone can stop him, he begins to strike wildly, slashing, shouting incoherently, killing several of his knights. When they finally subdue him, he collapses from exhaustion, muttering nonsense. He does not recognize anyone, not his generals, not his friends, not even his own name. For weeks, he lies in fevered silence. Then, slowly, he awakens, but something is broken. At first, there are only odd lapses. He forgets faces, mistakes servants for strangers, bursts into laughter at funerals. Then come the delusions, whispers that his blood is poisoned, that his enemies have replaced his body. He begins wandering the palace at night, barefoot, muttering prayers. Sometimes he refuses to bathe or change clothes for months. He bites attendants who try to restrain him. He forgets his queen entirely, one day embracing her tenderly, the next screaming that she is an impostor sent to murder him. And yet, in lucid moments, he is still the gentle boy of old, soft-spoken, remorseful, kind. The kingdom, unsure which Charles will wake each morning, begins to live in quiet terror. The doctors, theologians, and astrologers of France debate endlessly over the cause. Some say it is melancholia, a sickness of the soul brought on by bad humors. Others claim witchcraft or divine punishment. But the court, ever practical, sees opportunity. While the king drifts between lucidity and madness, his uncles reassert power. The Duke of Burgundy becomes de facto ruler once again, manipulating the Queen, the council, and even the royal finances. The same corruption Charles had once swept away returns, now hidden beneath the veil of royal incapacity. The young king's mind, meanwhile, continues to fracture. By 1395, Charles suffers from what chroniclers call the glass delusion. He believes that his body is made entirely of glass, delicate, transparent, and easily shattered. He refuses to be touched, sits motionless for hours, and orders special clothing lined with iron rods to prevent him from breaking. Servants must approach him softly, speaking in whispers. The palace becomes a tomb of soundless footsteps and closed doors. His illness becomes legend. Foreign ambassadors report that the King of France is a man of crystal. And yet, in the deep strangeness of his delusion, there is a metaphor for his entire reign, a man too fragile for the weight of his crown, ruling a realm that itself is cracking under pressure. The people of France begin to suffer again. Famine strikes in the north. The English, sensing weakness, resume raids along the coast. Taxes rise, coinage devalues, and the once proud kingdom slips back into decay. Still, the king's household tries to maintain appearances. Tournaments are held, music played, prayers whispered for the king's recovery. But beneath the gilded surface, the truth is unavoidable. France is being governed by ghosts. The ghosts of Charles's uncles, of his father's lost wisdom, and of the man the king himself used to be. By 1400, his condition has become permanent. The royal council meets without him, decrees are signed in his name, but written by others. Sometimes he wanders into the council chamber mid-meeting, dressed in rags, and everyone rises silently, unsure whether to bow. He stares at them blankly, then leaves. Outside the palace, Parisians whisper prayers for his soul. Inside, courtiers trade favors in the shadows. The beloved king has become Charles the Mad, Charles le Fou. Yet even in his madness, there are flashes of haunting poetry. On certain nights he calls for music, minstrels play softly while he murmurs to invisible companions. Once, he told his attendants that the dead kings of France visited him in dreams. or tall, crowned, and silent, walking through my chambers like smoke. They were not hallucinations of fear, but of longing, a mind broken by duty, haunted by the weight of its inheritance. Outside, the century turns. The world grows colder, harsher. The plague returns. England and France sink once more into the long shadow of war. And within the walls of the H. Saint Paul in Paris, the King of France rocks gently in his chair, wrapped in layers of linen, whispering that he must not move too quickly, or he might shatter. It is now the early years of the 15th century, and though Charles VI still wears the crown of France, the kingdom itself has begun to decay, quietly, like a painting fading under centuries of candle smoke. For more than a decade, the court has learned to live in the presence of madness. Ministers whisper their reports to empty chairs. Royal decrees are signed with trembling hands not belonging to the king. The Queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, moves through the corridors with the steady grace of someone who has stopped expecting miracles. France, once the heart of medieval Europe, has become a place of strange stillness, a court ruled by absence. In public ceremonies, Charles is occasionally brought out, dressed in jewels, smiling faintly as if in a dream. He greets the people with gentle gestures, sometimes even weeping when they cheer. But often, he doesn't recognize where he is. At one festival in Paris, he was presented with gifts from a visiting delegation. When one of the noblemen knelt to kiss his hand, the king recoiled and whispered, "Do not touch me, I am made of glass." The courtiers laughed politely. The delegation bowed awkwardly. The king was led away in silence, behind closed doors. Servants resumed the rituals of care that had become their lives, washing him, dressing him, keeping him safe from his own thoughts. His physicians prescribed everything from bleeding to rosewater infusions, from exorcisms to pilgrimages. Nothing changed. And while the doctors tried to mend his mind, the politicians devoured his kingdom. Without a capable monarch, France splintered into factions. At the center of the struggle were two powerful men, Louis, Duke of Orleans, the king's brother, and Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, the king's uncle. Louis of Orleans was handsome, cultured, and impulsive, a lover of poetry, luxury, and women. He saw himself as a natural regent and grew close to Queen Isabeau. Their friendship, or perhaps their closeness beyond friendship, fueled whispers that still echo through history. Philip of Burgundy, by contrast, was pragmatic and cold. He had ruled France once before, during Charles's minority, and he intended to rule again. The result was inevitable rivalry, resentment, and eventually blood. The French court divided almost overnight. On one side stood the Armagnacs, loyal to the Duke of Orleans. On the other, the Burgundians, loyal to the Duke of Burgundy. What began as political maneuvering soon became a full civil war. In Paris, banners were torn down. Soldiers loyal to one faction raided the homes of the other. Taxes were seized at sword point. Priests in their pulpits prayed not for peace, but for victory over their countrymen, the people. Always the quiet witnesses of history, suffered most. Bread grew scarce. Streets once filled with laughter became places of curfews and executions. And above it all, the king, lost in his private storms, sat unmoving, wrapped in fur and fear, murmuring to no one in particular. Then, in 1404, the first great pillar of the old order fell. Philip the Bold died, leaving his title and his vast Burgundian estates to his son, John the Fearless. The new Duke of Burgundy inherited not only his father's power but also his hatred. John was a man of action, impulsive, proud, and utterly convinced of his righteousness. He despised the Orleans faction and believed that France's decline stemmed from their corruption and the Queen's alleged infidelity. To him, Louis of Orleans was not just a rival, he was a disease in the body of the realm. So one cold November evening in 1407, as Louis rode home through the streets of Paris after visiting Queen Isabeau, assassins struck. They dragged him from his horse, pinned him to the cobblestones, and hacked him to death with axes. The killers did not flee. They shouted that their master, the Duke of Burgundy, had ordered it. Paris, stunned, fell silent. John the Fearless later admitted openly to the crime. He argued that the murder was not an act of treason but of justice, that he had rid France of a corrupting influence. And astonishingly many agreed. The people of Paris, wary of taxes and rumors of courtly excess, began to see Burgundy as a hero, a man who acted when others whispered. But in the quiet corridors of the Louvre, Queen Isabeau's grief turned to fury. The blood feud that followed would scar France for generations. The Duke of Orleans' son, Charles of Orleans, swore vengeance. The Armagnac faction armed itself for war, and all the while the mad king, the man whose name still carried divine authority, drifted in and out of awareness, unable to comprehend that his kingdom was now devouring itself. In 1410, civil war erupted in full. The Armagnacs and Burgundians turned the cities of France into battlegrounds. Paris changed hands repeatedly, a city of barricades and corpses, its people punished for whatever faction had lost that week. Outside the walls, English ships gathered in the Channel, watching with cold patience. For them, the timing was perfect. The long truce in the 100 Years' War was about to end. In 1413, the Burgundians seized Paris again. The Armagnacs fled south, regrouping in Orléans and Bourges. The Queen, fearing for her safety, attempted to mediate peace between the factions, but every truce she negotiated was broken within months. The people, starved and exhausted, began to lose faith in both sides. In taverns they spoke bitterly of the king's madness, how it mirrored the madness of France itself. They said the crown was cursed, that God had turned his face away from the Valois. When Charles occasionally appeared in public, pale, vacant, sometimes laughing, sometimes weeping, the crowds would kneel out of habit, but their eyes were empty. Then in 1415 came the disaster that changed everything: the Battle of Agincourt. England under King Henry V invaded northern France. The French nobility, divided by faction, gathered a vast army to repel them. But unity was a dream. The Armagnac lords distrusted the Burgundian officers. The commanders argued over who should lead. The army moved slowly, burdened by pride and confusion. When they finally met the English on a muddy field in Picardy, their fate was sealed. The rain turned the ground into a swamp. The French knights, weighed down by armor, charged recklessly into narrow lines of English archers. The result was slaughter. Thousands of French nobles were killed or captured. Among them, Charles of Orléans himself. News of the defeat reached Paris days later. Bells tolled, not for mourning but for despair. It was said that when the news was told to King Charles, he did not seem to understand. He simply nodded, whispered something about angels in the mud, and fell asleep. The loss at Agincourt shattered what little order remained. Queen Isabeau, desperate to preserve some stability, turned once again to the Duke of Burgundy, now the most powerful man in France. Together they established a new government in Paris. But the Armagnacs, led by Bernard of Armagnac, refused to accept it. They took control of the royal heir, the Dauphin Charles, and declared themselves the true guardians of France. The country now had two governments, two capitals, two kings in all but name. And at the center of this fractured world, the true king of France sat alone, rocking gently, asking for his children by names they no longer used. In 1418, Paris erupted once again. Burgundian soldiers stormed the city, massacring Armagnac supporters in the streets. Corpses floated in the Seine. The Queen returned to the capital, now firmly under Burgundian control. Charles VI, barely aware of events, was told that peace had finally been restored. He smiled faintly and said, "Then let the bells ring, I wish to hear them." The bells rang all night, not for peace, but for the dead. In these years, a kind of eerie routine returned to the court. The king was occasionally shown to ambassadors, or brought to mass, or paraded through Paris in solemn processions. He was, in every sense, a living relic, proof that the monarchy still existed, even as it decayed before everyone's eyes. His attendants described moments of startling lucidity. Sometimes he would speak of his childhood, of his coronation, of his father's library, of the smell of wax and parchment. Then, without warning, he would drift away again. At times, he mistook courtiers for dead friends, or called for his long-dead dog. And yet, perhaps the saddest moments came not in his delusions, but in his rare awakenings. When he realized what France had become, he would weep and beg forgiveness for, having failed to protect the realm God entrusted to me. No one could comfort him. In 1419, the last fragile hope of reconciliation was shattered. A meeting was arranged between the Dauphin Charles and John the Fearless, the Duke of Burgundy. It was to be a peace conference, held on a bridge at Montereau. But when the two parties met, tensions flared, angry words were exchanged, swords flashed. John the Fearless, the most powerful man in France, was struck down and killed. The murder ignited a new wave of chaos. The Burgundians, enraged, turned fully to the English for revenge. Within 2 years they would deliver Paris and the Mad King into English hands. By 1420, France was no longer a kingdom. It was a corpse divided among heirs. That spring, Queen Isabeau signed the Treaty of Troyes, a document that stunned Europe. It declared that Charles VI's daughter Catherine would marry Henry V of England, and that upon the death of Charles, Henry, not the Dauphin, would inherit the throne of France. In effect, the Valois dynasty had been erased. The old, broken king was brought forward to sign the treaty. His hand shook. His eyes wandered across the page as if he couldn't see the words. When he placed his seal upon the parchment, France's sovereignty slipped away with the wax. The courtiers bowed, the English rejoiced, the Burgundians smiled grimly. Only the wind through the palace corridors seemed to mourn. Outside the city, in the villages and fields, the people whispered prayers not for their king, but for deliverance. They said the land itself was mad, poisoned by ambition, divided by ghosts. And perhaps they were right, for in the years that followed, the English ruled Paris, the Burgundians ruled Burgundy, and the French heir wandered the south in exile. The true king of France, meanwhile, drifted in and out of awareness, a shadow surrounded by shadows. He no longer knew that he had given away his crown. In the quiet halls of the Tel Saint Paul, servants still carried out the rituals of monarchy. They set the table each evening, as if awaiting a dinner that would never be served. They polished the crown and placed it near his bed. Sometimes, in the night, Charles would wake and ask, "As my kingdom well?" The attendants would answer softly, "Yes, sire, all is well." He would smile faintly, close his eyes, and sink back into sleep. The year is 1421, and the bells of Paris sound strange in the night. They no longer toll for victories, nor for coronations, nor for saints' days. They toll for the dead, and for the living who no longer remember how to hope. The King of France, Charles VA, once called the Beloved, lies within his residence, the Tel Saint Paul, a palace now half abandoned and dim. The stone walls are damp from the river fog, the tapestries fading, the echoes soft and empty. He is 52 years old. But to look upon him, you might think him much older. His body thin, his hair gone grey and brittle, his mind a tide that comes and goes without warning. At times he smiles and speaks clearly, recalling the tournaments of his youth or asking after the state of Normandy. At other times, he mutters to invisible courtiers or clutches the air, as if warding off unseen threats. He sleeps on a narrow bed beneath a crucifix, the crown of France kept in a chest nearby, wrapped in velvet. He has not worn it in years. Outside his windows, France is no longer his. By 1421, the English hold Paris, Normandy, and much of the north. Their banners hang over the city gates, red and white, bearing the lions of England. Soldiers with strange accents patrol the bridges and the markets. The people have grown used to it. For years they have survived famine, plague, and the war of factions. An English garrison is just another flag above the same hunger. The Treaty of Troyes, signed the year before, has made England's king, Henry V, heir to the French crown. His young queen, Catherine of Valois, the daughter of Charles VI, is now a symbol of the uneasy peace between two nations that have only ever known war. But it is peace in name only, for even as the treaty is celebrated, rebellion flickers in the south, where the Dauphin Charles, disinherited by his mother's hand, still claims the throne. In truth, France now has two kings, and one of them does not even remember that he reigns. Those who serve Charles VI in his final years describe a quiet routine that borders on ritual. Each morning, the attendants draw back the curtains and greet him with the same words, "God give you good day, sire. You are in Paris and all is well." They dress him in fine robes, though he rarely leaves his chambers. They bring him simple meals, broth, bread, wine. He eats little, sometimes refusing food for days. He often sits for hours by the window, watching the river below. When asked what he is thinking, he sometimes says, "I am waiting for my father." At night, he is restless. The physicians say he suffers from visions. He speaks to the air, names forgotten faces, or insists that the walls are turning to glass. Once, he told a priest that he could see angels walking through the corridors. "Their feet do not make sound, but they weep when they look at me." Though forgotten by the world outside, the king's name still carries weight in ceremony. When English and Burgundian envoys meet to discuss the governance of France, they still begin each session by invoking his authority. By the will of the most Christian king, Charles VI, they use his seal, they swear loyalty to his crown, but they rule without him. To them, he is both an excuse and a relic, the ghost of legitimacy haunting their ambitions. Then one bitter winter, everything begins to change again. In 1422, King Henry V of England, conqueror of France, heir by treaty, falls ill with dysentery near Vincennes. He is only 35. The illness is sudden and severe. His body weakens. His physicians, unable to save him, record his final words. "We have not kept our promise to God, pray for me." He dies on August 31st. The English commanders are stunned. Their new King of France is gone, leaving behind only a baby son, Henry VI, less than a year old. And now, ironically, the kingdom they sought to rule through treaties and lineage finds itself again dependent on the man they had already erased. Charles VI, the forgotten, broken king. In the autumn that follows, Paris feels suspended between two worlds. Rumors spread that the old French king is dying. Candles burn in churches across the city. The air smells of smoke, frost, and incense. At the Hôtel Saint Paul, his attendants keep vigil. He has stopped eating. His voice is faint. A confessor is summoned, and the priests whisper the last rites. The chronicles tell us that in those final days, Charles spoke very little. When he did, it was mostly about his youth, about gardens, tournaments, and the face of his father. He asked once whether France was quiet now, and his attendants, weeping softly, told him yes. He smiled and said only, "Then I will rest." Charles VI of France died on October 21, 1322. He was buried at Saint Denis, the ancient resting place of French kings, beside his parents. His funeral was quiet, attended by both English and Burgundian officials. The Queen Isabeau did not come. The priests intoned Latin prayers as the coffin was lowered into the crypt. Above them, the stained glass of the abbey glowed faintly, red and blue, like the faded memory of his coronation robes. No one spoke of Charles the Beloved. No one spoke of Charles the Mad. He was simply the king who had died. When the news spread, both halves of France responded in silence. In Paris, English soldiers stood guard at the gates while the bells tolled. In the south, the Dauphin's followers heard the news with a strange mix of sorrow and opportunity. For though Charles VI's body was gone, his death left behind a question that no treaty could settle. Who was now the rightful king of France? By law, the English law of the Treaty of Troyes, it was Henry VIII, the infant son of Henry V and Catherine. By blood, the ancient French principle of inheritance, it was the Dauphin Charles, the disinherited prince still clinging to power in exile. Two kings, two crowns, one country. The war that had begun before Charles's birth would now begin again. And yet in the quiet rooms of the abandoned palace, one could almost imagine his presence lingering. The servants, when they passed through at night, claimed to hear faint footsteps in the hallways, or the creak of a chair though no one sat there. Some swore that the smell of incense and wax still hung in the air, the same as on the day of his coronation 42 years before. Others said they sometimes heard a voice whisper, "Do not touch me, I am made of glass." In the centuries that followed, historians would argue endlessly about him. Was he truly mad, a victim of heredity, perhaps of the same illness that would later afflict his descendants? Or was he broken by the unbearable weight of kingship, by the wars, betrayals, and pressures of a realm constantly at war with itself? Some saw him as a symbol of human fragility, a man crushed not by sin, but by circumstance. Others dismissed him as a tragic footnote, a cautionary tale about weak monarchs in violent times. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, for Charles VI lived through one of the most turbulent centuries in Europe. He saw the 100 Years' War consume generations, the plague return again and again, the nobility turn against itself. And through it all he remained, fragile yet enduring, like the glass he believed himself to be. In the quiet study of history, there is something almost tender about him. He was not a tyrant, nor a conqueror, nor a visionary. He was simply a man, caught between duty and delusion, born into a world too cruel for his gentleness. When you close your eyes and picture him, pale, still, gazing from a palace window, you can almost hear the soft rustle of his robes, the distant hum of bells, the whisper of an age that has long since vanished. And in that silence, perhaps, you feel the real weight of history, not in the battles or the treaties, but in the quiet sorrow of a life unraveling slowly beneath a crown. When dawn rises over Paris, the sign glitters faintly in the light, and for a moment the water looks like glass. Some say that, if you look closely enough, you can still see the reflection of a king who once believed he would shatter. Reflection. Charles VI's life reminds us that power does not protect the mind, and that the fragility of rulers often mirrors the fragility of nations. His madness broke not only his crown but also the illusion that kings are more than human. He was, in the end, a mirror, showing France what it had become: brilliant, fractured, and endlessly haunted by its own reflection. The story begins not with a crown, but with a shadow. It is the shadow of Richard the Lionheart, carved deep into the stone of English memory, the Crusader king, the warrior, the absent hero. When he dies in 1199, struck by a crossbow bolt during a siege in France, the crown passes to his younger brother John. John, the fifth son of Henry VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine, had never expected to rule. He was clever, restless, and ambitious, but he carried with him a flaw that history would never forgive. He wanted power, but he never understood how to keep it. At his coronation in Westminster Abbey, The monks chant solemnly as the golden crown is lowered onto his head. It glitters, but the court whispers already. They call him John Lackland, a name given long ago because he inherited no estates. Now, even with a crown, the name seems to linger like a curse. The kingdom he inherits is vast but fragile. Through his father's conquests and his brother's wars, England holds not just the island itself, but also great swaths of France. Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Poitou, and Aquitaine. This Angevin Empire, as later historians will call it, stretches from the cold cliffs of the Channel to the warm vineyards of Gascony. It is less a country than a patchwork of loyalties. Half French, half English, united only by the will of a dynasty. To keep such a realm requires strength, wealth, and trust. John has none of these. In his first years as king, he tries to rule like his brother, boldly, decisively with iron. But where Richard inspired fear and loyalty, John breeds resentment and suspicion. He demands taxes for wars he never wins. He quarrels with his barons, seduces their wives, and seizes their lands on the slightest pretext. He imprisons rivals in dungeons and lets them die quietly in chains. The chronicler Matthew Paris would later write, "Hell itself was defiled by the presence of John." Perhaps that is too harsh. But even his allies find him difficult to love. The first great loss comes in 1204. John's armies, stretched thin and badly led, are driven out of Normandy by the young and capable Philip II of France, known as Philip Augustus. It is a catastrophe. Normandy had been the heart of the English crown's power on the continent since the days of William the Conqueror. When news reaches London that the duchy is gone, the silence in the court is heavy. The chroniclers say John flew into a rage, tearing at his clothes, screaming that his vassals had betrayed him. But rage cannot rebuild an empire. From that year on, the English kings would remain rulers of an island, not a continent. The loss of Normandy begins a spiral that no king could have survived, but John accelerates it with his own cruelty. He raises taxes endlessly, demanding money for campaigns he never properly fights. The great families of England, men like de Braose, de Lacy, Fitzwalter, begin to turn against him. He orders executions without trial, and sometimes worse. When one baron's wife offends him, he starves her and her children to death in a castle dungeon. Even the church becomes his enemy. In 1207, John quarrels with the Pope. The dispute begins over a simple question: who should be Archbishop of Canterbury? John wants his own candidate. The Pope, Innocent III, insists on his. Neither will yield, so the Pope strikes first. He places England under interdict, a kind of spiritual blackout. Churches close. Bells fall silent. The sacraments, marriage, confession, burial, are forbidden. For 6 long years, the land lives without the rituals of faith. The people whisper that the king has brought God's curse upon them. John retaliates by seizing church property, taxing the clergy, and threatening any priest who disobeys him. But the weight of heaven is too much for one man to fight. In 1213, faced with rebellion and invasion, John surrenders. He kneels before a papal envoy and hands over his crown to be returned to him as a vassal of the Pope. It is a moment of humiliation unlike any other in English history. For the first time, the King of England becomes a tenant of the church. Yet John is not finished. 2 years later, he launches one final campaign to reclaim his lost lands in France. In 1214, he gathers a vast army and crosses the Channel, his ships crowding the harbours of Portsmouth and Barfleur. It is a desperate gamble, one last attempt to restore the glory of his dynasty. But the French King Philip II is ready. His son, Prince Louis, commands a disciplined army. His allies fight with precision. The decisive clash comes at Bouvines near modern-day Lille. John himself is not there. His forces are defeated in the north while he retreats in the south, his strategy collapsing. The battle is a disaster. The English and their allies are routed. When the news reaches John, he falls silent for hours. Then he laughs bitterly and says, "Those who trust in luck are ruined." When he returns to England, the barons are waiting. They have endured his taxes, his wars, his vengeance. Now they see that he has failed utterly. In 1215, rebellion sweeps across the realm. Castles are seized, banners raised. The barons, led by men like Robert Fitzwalter, march on London and take it. The city, the beating heart of royal power, is lost. John is forced to negotiate. He meets his enemies on the meadow of Runnymede beside the slow, brown waters of the Thames. It is June 15th, 1215. The air is hot and heavy, the ground muddy from rain. Here, surrounded by tents and armed men, John seals a parchment that will change the world, the Magna Carta. The Charter is not a gift of freedom. It is a surrender. It promises that the king will rule by law, not by will. That no free man shall be imprisoned without judgment. That justice cannot be sold or delayed. that the church shall be free, and that the baron's rights shall be respected. To John it is a humiliation. To history it is the first spark of constitutional liberty. But in that moment it is simply a truce. Within weeks, John breaks his promises. He writes to the Pope declaring the Magna Carta void, calling it not only shameful but illegal. Civil war erupts again. In the final months of his reign, the king becomes a hunted man. He rides across the country, his troops scattered, his supplies dwindling. His enemies, the rebel barons and Prince Louis of France, close in from all sides. In October 1216 he falls ill while crossing the marshlands of Lincolnshire. Some say it is dysentery, others whisper that he was poisoned. He takes refuge at Newark Castle, feverish and weak. The chronicles describe him as swollen, sweating and delirious. He calls for fruit and eats too much of it, worsening his sickness. In the small hours of the night, he asks for a monk to read to him from the Psalms. When the reader reaches the line, "My soul cleaveth unto the dust," the king sighs and says, "So it is with me." He dies soon after, in his 49th year. They bury him in Worcester Cathedral, far from London, far from the empire his family once ruled. Above his tomb, a stone effigy shows him in royal robes, the crown tilted slightly, as though too heavy for his head. The monks pray quietly. Outside, the rain falls on the River Severn, washing away the tracks of his soldiers. History has not been kind to King John. In the centuries that followed, chroniclers painted him as a villain, cruel, cowardly, faithless. Shakespeare would make him a tragic figure of weakness and deceit, and yet, perhaps that is why he endures. For in John we see not the triumph of kingship, but its unraveling, the moment when divine right gives way to human failure. His reign ended with rebellion, but also with a document that outlived him by centuries. The Magna Carta, born of his defeat, became the foundation for the rule of law in the English-speaking world. In that sense, his failure built the future. When you close your eyes and picture him, you might see a lonely man in a candlelit tent, his hands trembling as he presses the royal seal into wax, knowing that the world is slipping away. The crown gleams faintly beside him, heavy with the weight of every promise he could not keep. The year is 1215, and the kingdom of England is trembling like an overstrained bow. The barons have gathered their armies. The Pope has withdrawn his blessing. The peasants whisper that God himself has turned his face away. And in a damp field beside the River Thames, under a grey and swollen sky, the King of England rides into history. Runnymede, an unassuming meadow of reeds and sedge, becomes, for a few days in June, the silent heart of empire and resistance. King John arrives surrounded by banners and soldiers. His royal tent, striped in scarlet and gold, stands apart from the barons' camp like a lion in a pen of wolves. The barons, led by Robert Fitzwalter Eustace de Vesey and Sahar de Quincy, come armoured not for ceremony, but for war. Their lances are lowered, their tempers short. They are not here to kneel. They are here to bind a king. When you picture the scene, imagine the tension that hangs in the air. The wind stirs the grass. The smell of wet leather, horses, and wax drifts over the river. Somewhere, a clerk coughs softly, waiting for the king to speak. John sits on a wooden stool inside his pavilion, a parchment spread before him. His eyes dart over the Latin script, line after line of restrictions and demands. He chews his lip, a habit of nervous anger. By the grace of God, King of England. The charter begins, though the grace of God feels far away. To understand what happens here, you must understand what the barons want. They are not idealists or philosophers. They are landowners, men who have been taxed into ruin, their rights trampled by a king who sees loyalty as weakness. Their grievances are painfully specific: unfair scutage taxes, arbitrary arrests, seized inheritances, the sale of justice to the highest bidder. The charter before them, the Magna Carta, is not a dream of liberty. It is a list of complaints, each one carved from years of humiliation. And yet, in that list, something vast begins to stir. Clause by clause, the scribes read it aloud. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. The words echo softly under the canvas. They are dry, legalistic, and revolutionary. For the first time, a king is told you are not above the law. It is not rebellion shouted from a battlefield, but rebellion written in ink. John signs because he must. His army is weakened, London is lost, and even his mercenaries, the Flemish troops he imported, are growing restless for pay. He dips his seal into warm wax and presses it to the parchment. The molten red hardens into history. Those who witness it later say his face was pale and expressionless, but his hand trembled. For a moment, it seems peace might return. The barons depart, each holding a copy of the charter, believing, foolishly, that they have tamed their king. But King John is not a man who forgives humiliation. The ink is barely dry before he begins to plot. He retreats to Winchester, sending letters to Rome. In one, he pleads with Pope Innocent III, calling the Magna Carta an act of violence and treason. He swears that he signed only under duress, and asks the Pope to annul it. The reply comes swiftly and decisively. In August, a papal bull declares the charter null, void, and of no effect. The Pope writes, "We utterly reject and condemn this charter, for it is shameful and demeaning to royal majesty." John smiles when he hears the words. His enemies will soon learn, he believes, that rebellion against a king is rebellion against God, but the barons will not bow. They have tasted power, and the promise of justice lingers like wine on their tongues. When word spreads that the Pope has annulled the charter, they gather again in arms, the countryside burns, castles are besieged. Baronial banners, the Black Lion of Fitzwalter, the Red Cross of Declare, flutter above towns that once flew the royal standard. The king calls them traitors, they call him perjurer. And in this bitter divide, England begins to break apart. At the edges of this conflict, the people watch in silence. The common folk, the farmers, millers, and tradesmen, do not understand the Latin of charters or papal decrees. They understand only that war means fire and famine. Fields go untended, roads become dangerous, the price of grain triples. In the market towns, stories spread that John has summoned demons to fight for him, that he rides at night with black dogs, that he has sold his soul to the devil himself. Perhaps it is only fear that breeds such tales, but they will outlive him by centuries. Meanwhile, John's world grows smaller. He still wears the crown, still issues decrees, but every command feels hollow. His barons ignore him, his subjects despise him, his foreign allies abandon him. Even his treasure, the vast hoard of gold, silver, and jewels he amassed through taxes and confiscations, is no longer safe. He moves it constantly from castle to castle, in heavy wagons guarded by mercenaries. It is said that he sleeps beside it at night, fearful that even his servants might steal it. The crown that once seemed too heavy now becomes his only comfort. In 1216, the barons commit the ultimate act of defiance. They invite a foreign prince to take the English throne. Prince Louis of France, son of King Philip II, lands with an army at Sandwich in Kent. For the first time since the Norman conquest, a foreign invader walks freely through English soil. Not as a conqueror, but as a guest of the English nobility. John flees. He travels restlessly from Winchester to Cambridge to Lincolnshire, sleeping little, always on the move. He orders bridges burned, roads flooded, towns plundered, not to defeat his enemies, but to deny them comfort. The land becomes a wasteland of his own making. By the time autumn comes, the king is exhausted. His health fails, his forces dwindle. Even the weather turns against him. Endless rain, swollen rivers, impassable marshes. In October, he reaches the estuary of the River Wellstream near the Wash. There, in the fading light, his baggage train attempts to cross at low tide. The wagons, heavy with treasure, sink into the soft sand. Horses panic, men cry out, and one by one the carts vanish beneath the water. Chests of silver, gold goblets, relics, and royal jewels, even the legendary crown jewels of England, are swallowed by the mud and sea. The king watches helplessly as the tide closes over them. It is as if the earth itself has taken payment for his sins. That night, soaked and shivering, John falls ill. The chronicles call it a violent flux, dysentery. He rides on delirious toward Newark Castle, where he will die within days. But before the end, his mind drifts back to Runnymede, to the moment when the ink blowed into parchment, when the words he hated most became immortal. Perhaps, in his fevered dreams, he sees the ghosts of those barons standing again in the mist, silent and patient. Perhaps he wonders whether the seal he pressed that day was not a mark of defeat, but of transformation, a curse that would become a covenant. Years later, when the fighting ends and the crown passes to his young son Henry Asue, the Magna Carta will be reissued. Its most dangerous lines will be softened, its demands rewritten, but its heart will remain. Each time it is reaffirmed, it becomes stronger, clearer, more lasting. And long after John's bones have turned to dust, the idea will grow that even kings must answer to law. Runnymede today is quiet. The river still flows slowly through reeds and meadows. Cows graze where armies once stood. On a small hill, there stands a simple stone monument built centuries later by the American Bar Association, a tribute from one nation of laws to another. Few visitors stay long. The air feels heavy there, as if history itself lingers in the soil. You can almost hear the distant murmur of Latin words carried by the wind. Nullus leber homo capiator. No free man shall be taken or imprisoned. It is a whisper that outlived its author, a promise written by fear and kept by time. When you close your eyes, imagine the meadow at twilight. The king's tent has been taken down, the baron's banners furled. Only the marks of hooves remain in the mud, fading slowly with the rain. The ghost of Runnymede walks there still, a king who lost his power and in losing it gave power to the world. The night of October 18th, 1216, was heavy with rain. Outside the thick walls of Newark Castle, the River Trent surged, swollen with autumn storms. Inside, the King of England lay dying. The servants kept a small fire burning in the hearth, though the smoke hung low and bitter in the air. The physicians, grim men in rough wool robes, moved quietly, mixing herbs and muttering Latin prayers. John's body was weak, his face pale and waxen. He had not slept in 2 days. Fever twisted his mind, dragging him between fits of anger and sudden soft laughter. He whispered to those near him that he could still hear the sound of the tide, the sucking mud of the wash, where his treasure had been swallowed by the sea. "Gone," he murmured, "all gone, even the crown." But beside him, on a wooden chest, the royal circlet still glimmered faintly in the candlelight, bent, scratched, and tarnished by travel, but unmistakably his. Only a handful of loyal men remained. Among them was William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, an old knight now past 70, but still upright, still calm. Marshal had served 4 kings before John and had seen what power could do to men. He did not flatter the dying monarch. He simply stayed by his side, as duty demanded. When John's voice faltered, Marshal gave him wine and whispered, "You are still the anointed of God, my lord." John smiled faintly. "Anointed," he rasped. "By whom? Rome has cursed me, England hates me, and God." He let the sentence fade into silence. In his fever, he drifted between memory and confession. He spoke of his father, Henry Sue, the great reformer of the realm, whose shadow he had never escaped. He spoke of Eleanor of Aquitaine, his formidable mother, who had ruled half of Europe with more dignity than any of her sons. He remembered his brother Richard, golden and adored, everything John was not. When Richard died from a stray bolt during the siege of Schluss, John had wept. But somewhere inside, a spark of envy had burned too. Now lying alone in a castle room that smelled of damp and smoke, he wondered whether Richard's death had been a curse disguised as a gift. The monks of the nearby Abbey of Croxton came to administer the last rites. They sprinkled holy water, held a crucifix before him, and recited the prayers for the dying. When asked whether he repented, John hesitated. "I have wronged many," he said quietly, "but I have been wronged by more." He turned his head away and stared into the fire. It is said that one of the monks, a young novice, began to weep. Perhaps even he felt pity for this man whom history would later call monster. At some point in the night, John called for parchment. He could barely hold a quill, so a clerk steadied his hand as he dictated his will. In it, he named William Marshal as protector of the realm and guardian of his 9-year-old son Henry. There were no long speeches, no poetic farewells. Just tired words, practical and short. He asked to be buried not in London, not in Winchester, but in Worcester Cathedral, between the shrines of St. Wulfstan and St. Oswald, local saints, not royal ones. Perhaps, even at the end, he sought a smaller kind of peace. Toward dawn, his strength faded completely. The rain stopped, leaving the castle strangely quiet. A single candle burned beside his bed. Its wax had pooled and hardened like cooled blood. He whispered something. No one could make out the words. Some said it was a prayer. Others thought it was the name of his lost son, Arthur of Brittany, whose mysterious death years earlier many blamed on John himself. The candle flickered once, twice, and went out. When the news reached the rebel camp, there was no celebration. The barons were wary of war. The country was shattered, its roads ruined, its fields scorched. They realized that the death of one man had not yet brought peace. Prince Louis of France still occupied London and much of the southeast. The barons were divided, some ready to surrender, others too proud to kneel. It was William Marshal, the old knight, who stepped forward and held the kingdom together. He took young Henry by the hand and led him to Gloucester, where the boy was crowned with a simple circlet. Not the lost jewels of the realm, but his mother's plain gold chaplet. Even the coronation oil was improvised, scraped together from what remained in the abbey stores. It was a fragile beginning. And yet, from that fragile moment, England began to heal. Marshal reissued the Magna Carta not as a weapon against the crown, but as a promise from it. He softened its harsher clauses, removed the more pointed baronial privileges, and offered it as a gesture of good faith to a wary nation. This time it worked. Gradually, the barons returned to loyalty. The French withdrew. By 1217, peace had come, not through conquest but through compromise, and thus the document that John had despised became the foundation of his son's reign. In Worcester Cathedral, the monks prepared John's burial. They washed the body, clothed it in royal robes, and placed it in a stone coffin. A crown was set upon his head, a scepter in his hand. The chroniclers tell us that his face was peaceful, though that may have been their kindness, not truth. They buried him in the heart of the cathedral, between saints whose names few now remember. Above him, a carved effigy shows his eyes half closed, his lips faintly curved, as if caught between arrogance and exhaustion. Visitors still pass that tomb today. Few linger long, and yet his ghost lingers, not in the cathedrals or castles, but in the laws, the charters, the quiet machinery of governance that outlived him. Every monarch after him would be measured against the shadow of his failure. No king of England would ever again hold absolute power unchecked. Even the greatest of them, Edward I, Henry v. Elizabeth, would feel the weight of that old parchment signed in a meadow by a man no one loved. In that sense, John lost everything, and gave the world a principle that would not die. It is strange, isn't it, how history remembers not the victories, but the limits. Not the men who conquered, but the men who were forced to yield. John's life was a litany of loss. Normandy, Anjou, the loyalty of his barons, the affection of his people. But in the end, that loss reshaped kingship itself. It drew a faint but unbreakable line between ruler and ruled, one that even centuries later would echo in parliaments, constitutions, and courts of law. If you were to stand tonight by the tomb in Worcester and listen closely, you might almost hear the quiet hum of that history. Not the grandeur of empires, but the patience of law. Not the cry of kings, but the murmur of ink drying on parchment. The true power of King John's reign was not the might of his armies, but the endurance of his failure. He reminds us that sometimes the most terrible kings leave the most necessary legacies. As dawn breaks through the stained glass windows of the cathedral, you can imagine the first rays of sunlight touching his stone crown. The light falls softly across his hands, still clutching a scepter he can no longer wield, and fades into the cold air of England's endless morning. In the summer of 1380, the boy who would become known as Charles the Mad was only 11 years old. He was quiet, pale, and easily frightened. His tutors said he preferred drawing patterns in the margins of his prayer book to practicing swordplay. But he was a prince, and in France, even a prince could not afford gentleness. When his father, Charles V, died that year, the bells of Notre Dame de Paris tolled for 7 days straight. Their deep, sorrowful notes rolled through the narrow streets, echoing across the bridges of the Seine, through the markets and the courtyards where bakers and cobblers paused to cross themselves. The boy was crowned Charles VI of France in Reims Cathedral, beneath the towering stained glass and the scent of lilies. The crown, too heavy for his small head, slipped forward, and his uncles, powerful men with hungry eyes, steadied it for him. The chroniclers say he wept during the ceremony, though whether from grief or fear, no one could tell. France itself was wary. The long 100 Years' War had drained the kingdom's treasure. The countryside still bore scars from English raids: burned villages, empty abbeys, fields overrun with weeds. Famine and plague had come in waves, thinning the population and filling the ditches outside every town with the dead. In Paris, the smell of rot mixed with the sweetness of roasting chestnuts. The stench of sewage carried on every gust of wind. And yet, even in this decay, the court glittered. Silks from Italy, spices from the East, carved ivory from Africa, all found their way to the halls of the Louvre Palace. It was a contradiction that defined late medieval France: grandeur on the surface, rot beneath. Because the king was still a child, the real power fell to his uncles, Philip the Bold of Burgundy, Louis of Anjou, and John of Berry. Each styled himself a protector of the realm. Each was, in truth, a thief. Taxes were raised, offices sold, and coin debased. The peasants, already starving, rebelled in sporadic uprisings that were quickly crushed. The young Charles watched all this from behind embroidered curtains, uncertain and silent. He saw his people's misery but could do nothing. Sometimes he would walk the gardens at dusk, speaking to no one, his steps tracing the same pattern in the gravel again and again, the first small sign of the obsessive rituals that would later dominate his life. By the time he turned 20, the kingdom was fracturing. But at last, Charles decided to rule in his own name. He dismissed his uncles from the council and surrounded himself with younger advisors. Men like Olivier de Clisson and the Marmosets, a reformist faction that dreamed of honest governance. For a brief, golden moment, France seemed to breathe again. Taxes were lowered, justice restored, the coinage stabilized. The people began to hope. Charles was hailed as Charles le Bien-Aimé, Charles the Beloved. He was tall, graceful and earnest, fond of music and falconry, and utterly devoted to his queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, a young woman with golden hair and a diplomatic smile. Together they represented a promise that the chaos of the past could be mended. But promises are fragile things in the hands of kings. In the summer of 1392, the illusion shattered. It began with a whisper of paranoia. A plot had been uncovered, an attempt on the life of Olivier de Clisson. The would-be assassin fled into Brittany, and Charles, consumed by fury, declared he would personally lead an army to punish the traitor. His advisors begged him to wait. The heat was oppressive, the roads unsafe, his mind unsettled from sleeplessness. But Charles would not listen. He rode out from Le Mans with his banners gleaming in the sun. 5,000 men, drums beating, armor clattering, the king at their head in shining mail. The journey began well enough. But as they entered the forest of Le Mans, something in the air changed. It was stiflingly hot. The horses sweated and stumbled. Flies swarmed the men's faces. Then, suddenly, from among the trees, a ragged peasant rushed forward, barefoot, wild-eyed, shouting, "Turn back, O king! You are betrayed." Before anyone could seize him, he vanished into the undergrowth. The words struck Charles like a physical blow. He froze in his saddle, his face pale. Moments later, as they continued down the road, a page accidentally dropped the king's lance. The clatter of steel echoed like thunder through the forest. Something snapped. Charles screamed, spurred his horse, and drew his sword. He turned on his own men, slashing wildly, shouting that they were traitors sent to kill him. He cut down 4 of his knights before they managed to wrestle him from his horse. When the madness passed, he fell silent, limp, trembling, eyes glassy. The King of France no longer knew who he was. They carried him back to Paris on a litter. For days he raved, clawing at the walls, calling himself George instead of Charles, insisting that he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. He refused to bathe, refused to change his clothes, refused to recognize his wife or children. Sometimes, he would sit motionless for hours, staring into a polished mirror, as though trying to remember the shape of his own face. At other times, he burst into violent laughter and chased his servants through the corridors until they fled in terror. The doctors bled him, prayed over him, burned incense, even applied ointments made from crushed emeralds. Nothing worked. The court whispered of witchcraft. Others said it was the curse of God, punishment for the corruption of the Valois line. France once again became a kingdom without a ruler. His uncles returned, eager to reclaim power, while Queen Isabeau struggled to protect her children. The Burgundian and Orleanist factions rose, brothers and cousins of the royal house turning against one another in bitter rivalry. The English watched from across the Channel, waiting. Charles would recover, sometimes for months at a time. He would attend councils, sign decrees, even lead ceremonies at Notre Dame, speaking with calm clarity. And then, as swiftly as it came, his reason would vanish again. He believed at one point that he was Saint George, at another, that he was a shepherd's son, and later, that he had no kingly blood at all. He forbade anyone to touch him, terrified that the vibration of another's hand would crack his invisible shell of glass. When courtiers approached, they were required to tiptoe and bow low, lest a sudden movement frighten him into madness again. At night, he wandered the palace corridors with a lantern, speaking softly to his own reflection in the window panes. The servants would hide behind pillars, watching the silhouette of their king drift by, tall, gaunt, wrapped in furs though the fire still burned. Once, a chronicler recorded that he paused before a polished door and whispered, "Do you still love me?" But the door, of course, did not answer. In the streets below, the people began to call him Charles le Fou, Charles the Mad. The poets, gentler in their phrasing, called him the Mirror King, for he reflected the fractures of the realm itself, bright and broken all at once. Because as his mind shattered, so too did France. The Dukes of Burgundy and Orleans drew the court into civil war. The treasury emptied again. The English invaded anew. Every decision, every act of state, had to pass through a haze of regencies and rivalries. The crown that had once slipped on a boy's head now weighed heavy on a madman's mind. And yet, amid all this, there was still something human, pitiful, almost tender, in Charles's confusion. He remembered moments of clarity, the laughter of his children, the music of the royal chapel, the scent of apple blossoms in the gardens of St. Paul. He would murmur their names to himself like prayers, Isabeau, Louis, Catherine, but memory and madness mingled until they were one. By the early 1400s, the kingdom teetered on collapse. The king lived half, dead in his own palace, and no one knew who truly ruled France. And so we pause here, with the sound of those same bells that had once crowned him, now tolling faintly through the night. A young king, once beloved, sits before a mirror, watching his own reflection tremble in the candlelight. He wonders whether the man he sees is truly there, or whether he, like his kingdom, has already shattered beyond repair. The year was 1393 and winter lay heavy upon Paris. Frost crept across the leaded windows of the royal palace. The courtyards were silent, save for the cawing of crows. Inside, candles burned through the long nights, illuminating the endless uncertainty of a court trapped between madness and ceremony. King Charles VI had suffered his first great episode of insanity only months before, yet his Queen Isabeau of Bavaria and his councillors still clung to hope. He had recovered, they said. He spoke clearly again, ate well, even smiled. And so, as Lent approached, the Queen decided to host a celebration. A masked ball, a brief escape from the grief and fear that hung over France. They called it Les Bals des Ardents, the Ball of the Burning Men. It began with laughter. The court gathered in the great hall of the Hôtel Saint Paul, where torches flickered against tapestries of crimson and gold. Musicians played soft airs on flutes and lutes. Servants poured wine spiced with cinnamon and honey. To amuse the guests, the king and 5 young noblemen disguised themselves as wild men of the forest. They covered their bodies with pitch and flax to resemble hair, bound with hemp cords, and wore masks of rough bark. They danced clumsily, howling and capering as the courtiers laughed and clapped. Then, suddenly, one of the torches, carried by the king's brother, Louis, Duke of Orléans, came too close. The flax caught fire. In an instant, the hall became an inferno. The music turned to screams. The dancers' costumes blazed like torches. Men rolled on the floor, clawing at their burning flesh. Women fainted. Courtiers tried to smother the flames with cloaks and wine. The Queen herself collapsed in horror as the firelight flickered against her jeweled headdress. Only one man survived unscathed, the king, saved when the Duchess of Berry, in a desperate act, threw her heavy skirts over him and smothered the flames with her own gown. The others burned to ash before the eyes of the entire court. When the smoke cleared, the survivors could hardly speak. The smell of charred pitch clung to the walls for weeks. In the following days, Paris seethed with rumors. The people said it was divine punishment, a sign that the king's mind was still unclean, that he had tempted God with vanity. Others whispered that it was the Duke of Orléans who had caused the fire deliberately, to curse his brother and seize the throne. Whatever the truth, the accident left a deep scar on Charles's fragile mind. He withdrew into silence, haunted by visions of fire and screaming faces. And slowly, inevitably, the madness returned. He began to wander the palace at night again, barefoot, his hair uncombed, muttering prayers in half-finished Latin. He no longer recognized the Queen. Once, he struck her when she approached him with a cup of wine. He ordered his servants to leave him alone. The King of France, he declared, is dead. When the physicians tried to restrain him, he wept and begged them not to shatter his body of glass. He refused to wash, refused to be clothed. His chambers became a ruin of rags and discarded food. Even the priests grew afraid. Meanwhile, beyond the palace walls, France began to devour itself. The absence of royal authority left a vacuum that others were eager to fill. 2 factions emerged, each claiming to act in the king's name. On one side stood the Armagnacs, led by the king's brother Louis of Orléans, ambitious and brilliant, a man of charm and calculation. On the other side were the Burgundians, led by John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, stern and shrewd, who believed Orléans' greed endangered the realm. At first it was a war of words, pamphlets, insults, veiled accusations, but soon it became war in truth. The Queen, Isabeau, trapped between these 2 men, tried to navigate the shifting loyalties of court. She was clever, perhaps too clever. She formed alliances with both sides at different times, sometimes playing one against the other. In the streets of Paris she was called Madame la Louve, the she-wolf. But her cunning was survival, not ambition. She ruled because her husband could not, and because her children would not live long enough to inherit without her protection. The weight of the crown had fallen entirely on her, a foreign queen in a kingdom crumbling beneath her feet. In 1407, the long-simmering hatred between Orléans and Burgundy reached its climax. One cold November night, as the Duke of Orléans rode through the streets of Paris, a band of masked men ambushed him near the church of Saint Innocents. They dragged him from his horse and hacked him to death with axes and swords. His body was left in the gutter, his blood staining the cobblestones black. The assassins had been hired by John the Fearless himself. When confronted, Burgundy did not deny it. Instead, he justified the murder as a just act, claiming he had freed France from a traitor who had bewitched the king. Shockingly, many Parisians believed him. Civil war erupted. The Armagnacs swore vengeance for their murdered leader. The Burgundians claimed to fight for justice and order. Paris, caught between them, became a city of barricades and executions. Bands of mercenaries roamed the countryside, plundering villages and abbeys. The once fertile lands of northern France turned again into wasteland. Meanwhile, Charles sat in his chamber, oblivious. Sometimes he spoke gently to the walls, believing they were his friends. Other times, he raged at invisible enemies, screaming until his voice broke. He could not tell dream from reality, nor his own memories from the stories whispered around him. There were rare moments of clarity. In one of these, it is said he summoned his son, the Dauphin Louis, and held his hand for a long time without speaking. Then he murmured, "The crown is too heavy for one head." When asked what he meant, he only smiled, a weary, vacant smile that frightened the courtiers more than his madness ever had. The war between Burgundy and the Armagnacs continued through the next decade. Each side claimed legitimacy, each committed atrocities. The people no longer knew whom to obey. Famine returned. Corpses hung from the gates of Paris, and still in the palace the king sat before his mirror, staring into the dim reflection of a crown that no longer belonged to him. By 1415, when news arrived of the English victory at Agincourt, France had become a broken mirror indeed. The English king Henry V saw opportunity in the chaos. He landed in Normandy and began a relentless campaign of conquest. The Burgundians refused to unite with the Armagnacs. The queen, desperate to preserve her children's lives, opened secret negotiations with the English. No one ruled France. Not the princes, not the dukes, and certainly not the man who still called himself king, wandering through his gardens, muttering about glass and fire. Sometimes late at night, Charles would pause by a window overlooking the Seine. He would listen to the sound of distant bells, the cries of the poor echoing through the alleys, and he would whisper, "All the world has cracked." Perhaps he was right, for in the shattering of his mind, the kingdom itself seemed to have mirrored his illness, splintering into 1,000 reflections, each fighting for its own distorted image of power. And so we end this part of the story, with a mad king in a darkened palace, and a kingdom devouring itself in his name. The crown of France has become a mirror, fractured, gleaming faintly, reflecting nothing whole. The year was 1417, and Paris was starving. The Seine flowed sluggishly under bridges crowded with beggars and soldiers. Smoke rose from chimneys of cheap coal. Bread riots broke out almost daily. The court had retreated into itself, a fragile, frightened world of silks and prayers. The king still lived, but few saw him anymore. His madness came and went like the turning of the seasons. Some days he wandered the palace corridor speaking softly to saints no one else could see. Other days he sat still for hours, his hands folded on his knees, his face blank as marble. They called him the Shadow in Velvet. His wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, now ruled openly in his stead. The people despised her for it. They accused her of greed, of adultery, of betraying the kingdom to the English, and perhaps, in their anger, they were not entirely wrong. For by then, the Queen's alliances had become a web of survival. She feared the Armagnac faction that still claimed loyalty to her husband. She mistrusted the Burgundians, whose knives had once cut down the Duke of Orleans. And above all, she feared for her children, the young princes and princesses whose futures were the last fragile hope of the Valois line. So when John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, proposed an alliance with the Queen against the Armagnacs, she agreed. It was an uneasy peace, bound not by trust but by exhaustion. Yet peace in France never lasted long. In 1418, the Burgundians seized Paris. Their soldiers stormed the city gates, slaughtering Armagnac supporters in the streets. The Queen, trapped inside the Hôtel Saint Paul, watched as the blood of her husband's loyalists ran through the gutters. The mob ransacked the palace, dragging nobles from their beds. The king, too mad to understand what was happening, reportedly smiled as the windows shattered around him. When the massacre ended, more than 3,000 Parisians were dead. The crown of France, already cracked, now dripped with blood. A year later, in 1419, tragedy struck again. The Dauphin, the king's surviving son and heir, also named Charles, sought reconciliation with John the Fearless. They met on the bridge at Montereau under a banner of truce. But as they approached one another, tempers flared. In the confusion, the Dauphin's men struck down John the Fearless with an axe, killing him instantly. The act destroyed any hope of unity. The new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, vowed vengeance. He turned to Henry V of England, the victor of Agincourt, and together they forged a pact that would change the fate of France forever. In 1420, Queen Isabeau signed the Treaty of Troyes. The document declared that upon Charles VI's death, the crown of France would pass not to his son, but to Henry V of England and his heirs. In return, Henry agreed to marry the king's daughter, Catherine of Valois. It was, in essence, a surrender, the quiet end of a kingdom too broken to resist. The people wept in disbelief. A French king signing away his country's soul, a queen surrendering her son's birthright, and a madman sitting silent as his throne was promised to a foreign crown. When the treaty was read aloud in the great hall of the palace, Charles sat on his throne, motionless. His eyes were vacant, his hands trembled slightly. The English envoys reported that he smiled faintly when they bowed before him. As though unaware of what was being decided, he called Henry, "my good son," and blessed the marriage with a hollow gesture of his hand. Afterward, when the courtiers dispersed, he remained seated long after the torches burned low. He asked one of his servants, "Tell me, am I still the King of France?" The servant, not knowing what to say, simply bowed and whispered, "Yes, sire." But the answer meant nothing. Henry V and Catherine were married soon after, in a ceremony filled with uneasy grandeur. They processed through the streets of Troyes beneath silk banners, stitched with the lilies of France and the lions of England intertwined. The chroniclers say that the people watched in silence. No cheers, no music, only the dull sound of hooves on cobblestones. For France, the union was not a celebration. It was a funeral. By 1422, fate turned once more. Henry V, still in his prime, fell ill with dysentery and died near Paris at the age of 35. Just 2 months later, King Charles VIII followed him. He died quietly, without ceremony, in the royal apartments of the Hôtel Saint Paul, the same rooms where he had raved and wept for decades. He was 53 years old. The end was strangely peaceful. Those present said his final hours were lucid. He received confession, blessed his children, and murmured prayers in a thin, tremulous voice. When the last candle burned low, he turned to the priest and whispered, "Now the mirror breaks." Then his eyes closed, and the long madness was over. His body was laid in state in Nota, Dame de Paris, surrounded by the same nobles who had betrayed him again and again. They said the king looked serene in death, pale, composed, almost young again. But beneath the velvet and gold, the kingdom he had ruled was in pieces. His son, the Dauphin Charles, disinherited by the Treaty of Troyes, refused to accept defeat. He fled south, gathering what support he could in the Loire Valley. Meanwhile, the infant Henry VI of England, born of Catherine and Henry, was proclaimed king of both England and France. 2 kings, 1 crown, and a ghost who would haunt them both. In the years that followed, France would be torn apart again, by war, by famine, by the long shadow of English occupation. But from the depths of that ruin would rise something extraordinary, a peasant girl from Domremy who claimed to hear voices from heaven. She would come to the Dauphin's aid, call herself the Maid of Orleans, and lift the banner of France once more. But that is another story, born from the ashes of the one we leave behind. As for Charles V, his tomb still lies in the Basilica of Saint Denis beside the kings who came before him. His effigy is carved in stone, the face calm, the eyes closed, hands folded in prayer. Few who look upon it today would guess that this man had lived half his life lost in madness, that his delusions had rewritten the map of Europe. And yet, perhaps there is a strange kind of grace in his story, because Charles VI, the Mirror King, reflected the truth of kingship itself, that power is fragile, that reason is fleeting, and that even the brightest crowns cast the darkest shadows. If you stand before his tomb at dusk, as the light fades through the stained glass, you might see your own reflection faintly glimmering on the cold marble, and for a brief moment you might wonder, how thin is the glass between order and madness, between ruler and ruin, between us and the ones who came before. Moscow in 1533 was a city of contradictions, gilded cupolas rising over muddy streets, monasteries wrapped in mist, and the distant echo of wolves crying from the forests beyond the Kremlin walls. When Grand Prince Vasily III died that year, his son Ivan, only 3 years old, became ruler of all Rus. Too young to hold a scepter, too small to command armies, yet the crown was set upon his fragile head. The coronation was solemn, half-whispered. Monks intoned prayers in Old Church Slavonic, incense curled toward the vaulted ceiling. Outside, the people knelt in the snow, murmuring blessings for the little prince. They called him Ivanushka Grozny, Ivan the Terrible. though at the time the word meant inspiring, formidable, almost divine. No one imagined then how closely that name would fit. For the first years of his life, Ivan lived in the shadows of the Kremlin's red brick towers. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, ruled as regent. She was young, intelligent, and fiercely protective. Yet her position was precarious. The boyars, Russia's powerful noble clans, despised her. They muttered that she was foreign by blood, descended from Lithuanians, and that her influence would ruin the old Russian ways. They waited for her to falter. When she died suddenly in 1538, many whispered poison had done its quiet work. Ivan was 8 years old. What followed was a childhood shaped by cruelty and neglect. The boyars, freed from Elena's authority, seized control of the court. Each family, Shuisky, Belsky, Glinsky, struggled for dominance, and amid their feuds stood a child king, ignored and humiliated. Servants stripped his household bare. His tutors were dismissed or bribed away. He was sometimes left hungry for days. He watched noblemen feast in his own palace, drinking from golden goblets, while he crouched behind pillars, unseen, his stomach hollow. They called him the orphan prince, and they were not wrong. It was in those long winters that Ivan learned to observe. He watched how power worked, how men bowed only to those who could destroy them, how flattery was just another kind of weapon. He learned, too, to read the scriptures. The monks of the Kremlin taught him that a ruler was appointed by God, that the Tsar was both shepherd and sword of his people. The boy listened in silence, eyes wide, his thin hands clasped around the illuminated manuscripts. But when the monks left, he would go to the palace kennels and throw small animals from the ramparts, watching how they fell. He was testing gravity and something darker. In 1543, when Ivan was 13, the boyars made a fatal mistake. One of their leaders, Prince Andrei Shuisky, struck him across the face during an argument in the palace hall. That night, Ivan summoned the palace guards, men who still swore loyalty to the crown. At dawn, they dragged Shuisky from his bed and threw him to Ivan's hunting dogs. The boy stood at the window as the prince screamed, his expression calm, almost curious. When it was over, he said only, "Now they will know who rules Moscow." And they did. From that moment, the court began to change. Ivan, though still a teenager, asserted his authority with precision. He studied every decree, every tax roll, every whisper of rebellion. He practiced his signature, Ivan, Tsar by the will of God, though officially he was still only Grand Prince. He dreamed of something greater. He dreamed of an empire united not by the wills of quarrelsome nobles, but by a single, sacred power. He dreamed of the Third Rome, a divine Moscow that would succeed where Rome and Constantinople had fallen. To the young Ivan, this was not ambition, it was destiny. When he turned 16, the court prepared for his coronation, the first of its kind in Russian history. The year was 1547, and for the first time a ruler of Muscovy would not be crowned merely as Grand Prince, but as Tsar of all the Russias. The word Tsar, derived from Caesar, carried immense weight. It meant emperor, chosen by God. It placed Ivan not beside other princes, but beside the great rulers of the world, the Holy Roman Emperor, the Ottoman Sultan. In the cathedral of the Dormition, beneath chandeliers heavy with wax, Ivan knelt before Metropolitan Makary. The priest anointed his forehead with holy oil, crowned him with the golden monarch's cap, and handed him the scepter. When Ivan rose, the bells of Moscow thundered. He was no longer a child, he was Tsar. For a brief moment, the kingdom seemed to bloom. Ivan married Anastasia Romanovna, a nobler woman known for her gentleness. She became his anchor, his quiet conscience. Together they began to reform the realm. The Tsar convened a council of advisors, the chosen Rada, composed not only of nobles but of priests and commoners. He ordered new laws to be written, standardized weights and measures, and curbed the worst abuses of the boyars. He even founded a postal service, slow and unreliable, but revolutionary in a land that spanned half a continent. To many, it seemed a golden age had dawned. But behind Ivan's cold blue eyes, the old memories still burned. The hunger, the humiliation, the endless fear. And fear, once learnt, rarely leaves quietly. In 1547, only months after his coronation, disaster struck again. On a hot June afternoon, fire broke out in the wooden streets near the Kremlin. Fanned by wind, the flames spread with terrifying speed. Within hours, half of Moscow was burning. People fled through the smoke, clutching icons and crying for mercy. The city's wooden roofs ignited like tinder, the sky turned black. When it was over, more than 3,000 were dead and 40,000 houses reduced to ash. The survivors, desperate and enraged, gathered before the palace and shouted that the fire had been caused by the Glinskys, Ivan's mother's family. They accused them of witchcraft, of summoning demons to consume the city. The mob stormed their estates. Several of Ivan's relatives were torn apart in the streets. The Tsar, trembling with fever, watched from the Kremlin walls. Something inside him broke. In the aftermath, Ivan withdrew from public life for months. He refused to eat, refused to speak, lay awake for nights staring at the ceiling beams. When he emerged, he was not the same. The gentle reforms continued, but a new edge of suspicion appeared. He ordered secret reports on the loyalty of every noble. He began to see omens in the flight of birds, in the shapes of clouds, in the dreams that haunted his sleep. Anastasia prayed beside him, soothing him with quiet hymns. For a time her presence kept the darkness at bay, but the seeds had been planted. By 1552, Ivan's ambitions turned outward. He marched east to conquer Kazan, the Tatar stronghold on the Volga River. It was a campaign of faith and fury, a crusade against the heirs of the Mongol Khans who had once ruled over Rus. The siege lasted months. Cannons thundered day and night. Finally, on October 2, the city fell. Ivan rode through the gates as the bells of Moscow pealed in triumph hundreds of miles away. He ordered a cathedral built to commemorate the victory, a strange, colourful temple of onion domes and swirling patterns that would later be known as St. Basil's Cathedral. To many, it was a symbol of divine favour. To Ivan, it was proof that he had fulfilled God's will. The boy who had once cowered in the shadows was now the scourge of empires, but victory can be its own poison. The more Ivan achieved, the more he saw enemies everywhere. Boyars plotting in silence, foreign spies lurking at his gates, demons whispering in the dark. And when, a few years later, Anastasia fell ill and died, the last fragile restraint on his mind shattered. The Tsar of all the Russias would soon become the terror of his own creation. And as the winter of his soul deepened, the bells of Moscow seemed to toll not for triumph, but for something slowly unraveling. The bells of Moscow tolled slow and heavy on a summer morning in 1560, as Tsarina Anastasia Romanovna was laid to rest in the Cathedral of the Archangel. She was only 29 years old. Her death marked the end of the last gentle influence over the Tsar's restless mind. To the people of Moscow, Anastasia had been a saintly figure, modest, kind, and devoted to her husband and the church. To Ivan, she had been his only light. And when that light went out, the shadows lengthened across the realm. He wept at first, refusing to leave her side for days. Then the weeping turned to silence. Finally, silence turned to rage. Ivan became convinced that she had been poisoned by the same boyars who had tormented his childhood, the same nobles who whispered behind every curtain. He demanded confessions. He demanded names. Servants were beaten, courtiers imprisoned, physicians tortured. None could prove her death was anything but illness. But for Ivan, belief mattered more than truth. The poison he imagined had entered not her veins, but his mind, and it would never leave. In the years that followed, the Tsar's paranoia grew like frost on glass. He withdrew from his advisors, dismissed old friends, and replaced them with spies. The chosen Rada, his once trusted council, was dissolved. Even the church could not restrain him. In 1564, after years of suspicion and unrest, Ivan did something no Russian ruler had ever done before. He abandoned Moscow. One morning, the palace gates stood open. The royal banners were gone. The people searched the city in confusion, only to learn that the Tsar had fled to the small town of Alexandrov, north of Moscow, taking with him his family, his treasures, and his personal guard. For weeks, the capital stood leaderless. Then, on a cold January day, a message arrived from Alexandrov. It was a letter written in the Tsar's own hand. He declared that he had abdicated, not because of his own failings, but because of the treachery, greed, and godlessness of the boyars and clergy. He accused them of betraying both him and God. Russia, he wrote, would now answer for its sins. Panic spread through the city. Without the Tsar, there was no ruler, no judge, no law, no protection. The people begged for his return. The boyars, terrified of rebellion, sent envoys to Alexandrov to plead with him. Ivan listened to them in silence. At last, he agreed to return, but on one condition: he would rule with absolute, divine authority, free from the meddling of nobles and church alike. He demanded the right to punish traitors as he saw fit without trial or law. The envoys, desperate, agreed, and so in 1565, Ivan returned to Moscow, not as the same man who had left, but as something transformed. He returned as the hand of God's wrath. That same year, he created the Oprichnina. It was more than a political reform. It was a reign of terror wrapped in ritual and mystery. Ivan divided his realm into two parts: the Oprichnina, ruled directly by him, under his personal command; the Zemshchina, governed by the boyars, though under his constant watch. He dressed his new order of enforcers, the oprychniki, in black robes and saddlecloths, embroidered with a dog's head and a broom, symbols of their mission to sniff out treason and sweep it away. They rode black horses through the streets, their faces concealed beneath hoods. The people said they moved like shadows, and that where they passed, the air smelled faintly of death. The oprychniki swore oaths of loyalty directly to the Tsar. They lived in their own quarters, separate from the rest of Moscow. Each dawn, they gathered in the darkened halls of Alexandrov for prayer, chanting the liturgy while Ivan, dressed in monastic robes, stood before them with a whip in his hand. Then the prayers ended, and the punishments began. Those accused of disloyalty, nobles, merchants, peasants, even priests, were dragged before the Tsar's tribunal. Torture became theatre. Executions, a kind of ceremony. Bodies were left hanging from the walls as warnings. In time, Moscow itself seemed to forget what mercy was. The first to fall were the old boyar families. Ivan confiscated their estates, sent their wives and children into exile, and distributed their lands to his oprychniki. Those who protested were accused of conspiracy. Confession was extracted by fire and blade. Soon no one dared to speak at all. Even among the oprychniki, fear spread. They were fanatically loyal, but they knew that loyalty to Ivan was like standing on thin ice. One wrong word, and the abyss waited below. The Tsar's madness, once cold and methodical, began to twist into something feverish. He saw omens in the flight of birds, devils in the corners of his chambers. He forced his courtiers to fast for weeks, then demanded they drink to his health until they collapsed. He ordered priests to bless mass executions, calling them acts of purification. And when the monasteries protested, he replied that he too was a monk, the monk of God's vengeance. In 1569, paranoia reached its peak. Ivan accused his cousin, Prince Vladimir of Staritsa, of treason, the same cousin who had once been considered his heir. He forced Vladimir to drink poison while his family was strangled before him. That night, Ivan attended church, singing hymns with tears streaming down his face. He told the priest that he had freed Vladimir's soul from temptation. No one dared to contradict him. Then came Novgorod. The ancient city had long been proud, independent, wealthy, a merchant hub closer in spirit to Europe than to Moscow. Rumors reached Ivan that Novgorod planned to betray him, to open its gates to Poland. Whether the rumor was true or not didn't matter. The Tsar gathered his oprychniki and rode west through the snow. It took them 5 weeks to reach the city. When they arrived, the bells rang in warning, but the gates were already under siege. What followed remains one of the darkest chapters in Russian history. For 5 weeks in the winter of 1570, Ivan's men terrorized Novgorod. The oprychniki went house to house, dragging out the inhabitants, merchants, priests, women, children. They accused them of treason, heresy, foreign sympathies. Then they drowned them beneath the ice of the Volkhov River, hundreds at a time. The chronicles say the river ran red for days. Church bells were torn from their towers, icons were smashed. Even the monasteries were not spared. The Tsar himself rode through the streets, blessing the soldiers and ordering the executions to continue. When it was over, more than 10,000 were dead. After Novgorod, the land seemed to sink into silence. Even the wind over the steppes carried a kind of dread. Ivan's wrath had no limit, but neither did his guilt. He began to fast obsessively, to pray for forgiveness, to lash himself during Lent until his robes were dark with blood. He built new churches in memory of those he had killed, then destroyed the villages around them for harboring imaginary traitors. His soul had become a pendulum swinging between repentance and rage. And then, in 1581, the unthinkable happened. During an argument in his private chambers, Ivan struck his eldest son and heir, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, across the head with his staff. The blow cracked his skull. The prince fell to the floor, blood pooling around him. As servants rushed in, the Tsar collapsed beside his son, screaming his name, pressing his hands against the wound, sobbing until his voice broke. The heir died within hours. Russia's future died with him. The courtiers whispered that the Tsar had finally killed not just his bloodline, but his own reason. He wandered the palace for days, muttering prayers, clutching the dead prince's robe. He confessed, he begged forgiveness, he punished his servants as if punishing himself. But no absolution could reach him. By the time the snow melted the next spring, Moscow was a hollow shell of what it had been. The oprychniki, once fierce and proud, now moved like ghosts. The common people crossed themselves when the Tsar's carriage passed. The sound of bells, once a symbol of divine order, had come to mean only death. In his last years, Ivan dissolved the oprychnina. He claimed it had fulfilled its purpose. But the truth was simpler, there was no one left to purge. The kingdom he had built on fear was crumbling. His treasury was empty, his borders threatened, his heirs gone. Only the echo of his own voice remained, the echo of a man who had wanted to be God's chosen ruler, but who had become his own executioner. And yet, even then, there was one final chapter still to come. The Tsar of all the Russias would not die quietly, but as he had lived in grandeur, contradiction, and the cold stillness of terror. The year was 1583, and Moscow was tired. The city, once alive with trade and laughter, now breathed in slow, weary sighs. Its people whispered of famine and ghosts. They still crossed themselves when the Tsar's carriage rolled by, though few dared look up to see the man inside. Ivan IV was now 53, old by the measure of his brutal time. His hair, once golden and thick, had gone thin and white. His beard had grown wild. His hands trembled when he held a pen, and yet his eyes still burned with that terrible, restless light. He lived among priests and astrologers obsessed with prophecies. He kept lists of sins written in his own hand, long scrolls covered in ink and blood, and ordered the monks to read them aloud to him as penance. Sometimes he wept, sometimes he laughed, and sometimes, in the middle of prayer, he would whisper, "Tell me, have they forgiven me yet?" But no one knew whom he meant. After the death of his beloved heir, Tsarevich Ivan, the throne had passed to his younger son, Fyodor, a gentle, pious, and simple-minded man who preferred bells and monasteries to politics or war. Fyodor's weakness left the realm vulnerable. The boyars, long cowed by terror, began once again to stir in quiet ambition. At court, the man who truly governed was Boris Godunov, the Tsar's trusted advisor, calm, intelligent, and cautious. He alone could speak to Ivan without trembling. He alone dared suggest limits to the Tsar's cruelty, and for that, Ivan both admired and feared him. Outside the Kremlin walls, the land itself groaned under the weight of years. Villages stood half empty. Fields lay untilled, their owners dead or fled. Entire regions had been depopulated by the Oprichnina's purges and endless wars. The treasury was nearly bare, and far to the west, Sweden and Poland, Lithuania pressed their advantage, carving away at Russia's borders while the Tsar's armies struggled to hold ground. What had begun as Ivan's dream of a divine empire was ending as a kingdom of ashes. Still, the Tsar could not stop searching for redemption. He built new churches in the names of saints he had long ignored. He donated to monasteries and ordered masses for the souls of those he had executed. He commissioned an enormous book, the Synodicon of the Disgraced, listing, name by name, every person he had condemned. Each page was a prayer for forgiveness, yet even this act of repentance carried a shadow. When monks asked why he wished to remember the dead, Ivan replied, "So that they may pray for me when I cannot pray for myself." Then, after a pause, he added quietly, "And so they will not forget who killed them." At times, his moods still turned violent. He struck servants for minor faults. He accused his courtiers of sorcery and sent them to dungeons that had long since overflowed. He forced his own daughter-in-law into a convent for wearing what he deemed immodest clothing. But those rages were shorter now, bursts of lightning that faded into long stretches of exhaustion and silence. When his fits passed, he would wander the palace corridors whispering prayers, sometimes stopping before an icon to stare at it for hours, as if waiting for it to speak. In 1584, the Tsar's health began to fail rapidly. He suffered from gout and swollen joints. He could barely mount a horse. Even so, he insisted on attending every mass, every meeting of state, every judgment. He had grown paranoid once more, convinced that someone would poison him, as he believed they had poisoned Anastasia so many years before. He demanded that food be tasted 3 times before he touched it. He ordered a secret tunnel built between his chambers and the cathedral so that he might reach God unseen. Each day, he seemed to move closer to death, and yet each day he resisted it, as though defiance could outlast destiny. And then on March 18th, 1584, death finally came, quietly, almost politely. That morning, Ivan had bathed, prayed, and dressed in his richest robes. He told his attendants that he felt unusually well. In the afternoon, he summoned several courtiers,